All right. Buenos días y buenas tardes, colegas, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Juanita Hinojosa, and I have the privilege of serving as the Research Associate for the HSI Resource Hub. The UNLV Resource Hub is funded by the National Science Foundation and aims to cultivate a community of STEM scholars who adapt and advance culturally responsive and relevant teaching practices at Hispanic serving institutions. This spring, we are focusing on funds of knowledge in STEM. We're excited to have Dr. Mejia as today's presenter, who is the second speaker of this series that's really highlighting how to understand, incorporate, and integrate funds of knowledge of students in STEM fields. To learn a little bit more about Dr. Mejia, so Dr. Joel Alejandro Mejia is a professor of engineering education and department head at the Department of Engineering and Computing Education at the University of Cincinnati. Prior to working in academia, he worked as a project manager for the Department of Defense Rio Tinto and FLS Smith Minerals. Dr. Mejia's work seeks to analyze and describe the assets, tensions, contradictions, and cultural collisions many Latinx students experience in engineering through pláticas and testimonios. His research has contributed to the integration of critical theoretical frameworks in engineering education to investigate deficit ideologies and their impact on minoritized communities. He is particularly interested in approaches that contribute to a more expansive understanding of engineering in social cultural contexts, bilingual engineering education, and the impact of critical consciousness in engineering practice. Dr. Mejia has received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists in Engineering Award in 2025, the highest honor bestowed by the U.S. government on outstanding scientists and engineers. And we're really, really excited to hear more about his work. So Dr. Mejia, with that, thank you once again for joining us today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Juanita, and thank you to the HSI Resource Hub for having me and presenting this work. So I'm gonna go ahead and share with you some of the work that I have been doing and talking about this important work on funds of knowledge. So I just want to make sure that you're seeing my slides and not necessarily my slide notes. Yes, okay. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Juanita. All right, so let's get us started. By the way, the picture that I have there is from the border between Tijuana and San Diego, just because it's one of the places where I did some of my research on funds of knowledge, and I want to share some of the great work that emerged from that, and it's definitely very dear to me, this work that was done in this border region. So let's get it started. What are we gonna do today? So first, I think that one of my goals is to help us think through what funds of knowledge are. So we want to define funds of knowledge, but also define funds of knowledge within the context of engineering. I'll talk a little bit about the history of funds of knowledge, how we got to where we are now in this research on funds of knowledge, and also think about what this means for engineering education. The second goal that I hope that, and something that I hope that you get from this workshop, from this presentation, is that you can start identifying, right? Identifying what are deficit-based practices and how we can shift toward a more asset-based practice in engineering education through funds of knowledge. And then the third goal that I have is I want we all to explore how household, community, language, and cultural knowledge and resources in engineering learning support work in engineering education. And I want to leave you with some homework. I want you to think about how you can generate ideas to integrate these things that we're going to talk about during this workshop regarding funds of knowledge into your teaching, your advising, or even your program design if that is something that you're planning on doing. Okay. Um, I think that before I get started, it's very important for me to kind of position my work and for you to learn a little bit more about who I am and where I come from and how that also informs a lot of the work that I do. Um, so I'll start by saying that I am a child that was born in the United States of two Mexican parents from Chihuahua, but we moved back to Chihuahua. So most of my growing up happened actually in this little town called Namiquipa in Chihuahua, Mexico. And my family, our family, it's a family of farmers. We grow corn and beans, and we had some cows. We had an apple orchard that had been, passed down to us for generations and generations and generations. And so it's not like we were rich, right? We were a family, low-income family that used this as a means to just survive, right? To get some money at the end of the harvesting season, and but also to grow our own food in our land. Eventually, after the um, N- North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, I was kind of forced to move back to the United States. So I can say that my story is a story also of displacement, right? It was not necessarily that I wanted to move alone without my family to the United States, but it was because that was the only way that I could get an education. And so I identify myself also as a transfronterizo because I grew up in El Paso and Juarez. So I moved when I was 14 years old. I went to high school in El Paso, not knowing a word of English. And even though I was doing pretty well in Mexico in math and science, I wasn't allowed to take, for example, AP courses. I was tracked into an ESL program, right? And so that is also part of my history, and that makes me who I am now. Um, Eventually I wanted to go to school. I wanted to get an education. I wanted to become an engineer. um, and so I went to the University of Texas at El Paso, and I got my bachelor's in materials and metallurgical engineering. And I'll say this: I think it was very important for me to attend a Hispanic serving institution, even though I had the opportunity to go to other places. A Hispanic serving institution really served in helping me find who I am as an individual. It helped me thrive. It helped me to find a place where I could be myself and still be an engineer, particularly because there's a lot of places where people like me are not necessarily seen as potential engineers. Even when I was about to go to college, I remember my counselor telling me, maybe you should consider this other thing, which was a vocational school in El Paso, right? And so I have a lot to say about Hispanic serving institutions because it really help shape who I am now and understand what it means to, like, for example, in UTEP, to be a transfronterizo and live in the borderlands constantly, right? And so eventually I graduated. I went to work for, um, I went to get my master's at the University of Utah, also in metallurgical engineering. I worked for the mining and the aerospace industries. And then eventually I decided to go into engineering education. One of the reasons why I wanted to get into engineering education was because what I was seeing as a practicing engineer, a lot of the times I was questioning, what are we doing out in the world as engineers, and what is the impact that we had? And I never had got an answer from my company about that, right? And so after seeing what other people were doing in the field, and not necessarily thinking critically about the impacts of our work in the world, that's when I decided I need to go and think more critically about engineering and potentially help other engineers, other future engineers build that critical consciousness. But also when I was going through my PhD, I started to ask the question, did what happened to me, does that continue to happen to others? Is that something that other Latino kids like me continue to experience in a classroom? And surprise, surprise, right? It does continue to happen. It still exists. Like this idea that if you come from a background where your first language is not English, for example, that you're not necessarily pretty good or ready to do math or science, right? And so that's where I started to think about, okay, how can we change the narrative about everything that we bring with us, that we contribute to the conversations of engineering? And can that make a change, right? So that's where I started my work on funds of knowledge as well. So that's a little bit of me, how I ended up doing this work and why it is so important to me. And I think that part of it is because we are trying to challenge those deficit ideologies, right? This idea that students that come from particular backgrounds are inherently deficient, right? So the funds of knowledge, when I was in graduate school, it provided kind of like this framework for me to think about the fact that knowledge is both situated and it's also embodied, right? That students are not blank slates when they come into the classroom, but that they actually offer a lot of things for knowledge construction. And so, funds of knowledge is this idea that there are accumulated cultural resources and strategic resources and skills and practices that students have and that they have accumulated historically, right? These are specific strategic bodies of essential information that households continuously use to maintain their well-being. All of this work on funds of knowledge actually started as an anthropological study in the Southwest, right? And trying to analyze how is it that communities thrive in these spaces, right? Like for example, where there's not a lot of water. So how do they get water to their communities, right? When they don't have access to doctors, right? And not necessarily just because they live far from a city, but also because in the history of the United States, sometimes access to doctors was very difficult for some of these communities, these Mexican American communities. And so, how do they do that? And so, Vélez Ibáñez and Greenberg did this study on funds of knowledge, and that's how the term started to get coined, right? Then Luis Moll um, started to look at it more from an educational perspective. Okay, so Vélez Ibáñez and Greenberg talked about how there are examples of carpentry, of building, folk medicine, mining, water management, all of that, right? That allows these families to continue to thrive in this under these conditions. And so Luis Moll, this is the picture of Luis Moll. Um, what he wanted to do with this idea of funds of knowledge is how can we use funds of knowledge to show to others that there is knowledge that comes from the home, from the communities, and that we need to make use of that in educational settings, right? So, funds of knowledge confronted this misconception that Mexican American students from low-income households they lack any type of adequate experiences for academic achievement, right? And funds of knowledge also try to highlight the labor history of the household. So what that did in turn is challenge the notion that working class children are academically deficient, right? Because of household inadequacies. How can I tell you, like, how can I give you an example of some of these ideologies? Um, I think that if you still go to Barnes and Noble, right, you will find books like that tell you the 3,000 word that your child needs to know before starting pre-K or something like that, right? That says a lot about this misconception that because if you grow up in a bilingual household, for example, that you have not developed the vocabulary to be successful, right? So that is just kind of like one example of how these deficit ideologies get created. And so by framing funds of knowledge about um, this wealth of resources and skills and practices that kids bring with them, it repositioned these students not as blank slates, but as individuals that actually could contribute a lot to the learning space in the classroom, right? And so, how is it that these funds of knowledge are created, or what are they characterized by? Well, they are characterized by kinship, by social networks, and by exchange. I think it is important to know here that funds of knowledge are intended to create reciprocity, right? That this actually counteracts this idea, this capitalist ideals of markets of supply and demand. And instead, you put more emphasis on labor skills, ingenuity, creativity, right? And you think about them as currency of exchange. How can we create, like people that come from low income backgrounds that don't necessarily have the financial means to do those things, they rely on funds of knowledge, right, as currency of exchange of labor, an exchange of skills, and an exchange of practices, right? And so, um, in order to do this, you need to have a trusting relationship with the networks that you have, right? So, in this sense, confianza, right, or reciprocal trust is what actually acts kind of like as the glue that helps maintain these networks. And in turns, it provides kind of like this basis for funds of knowledge to actually exist, right? Um, so, um, how do these networks of exchange happen? Right? Larissa Adler-Lomnitz, she did a study in Mexico City. This is a picture of the book that she did. It was an anthropological study where she was describing how this informal exchange of services and goods um, uh, within a social system develops a lot of the times in response to scarcity, right? And she was saying, you know, that scarcity, yes, tends to be framed as something that is completely negative in the public, right, in the public sphere. But what she was saying is like, no, this informal exchange actually leads to a lot of things that give individuals access to decision makers, right? It creates influence on administrative decisions. It it forms the foundation to just continue to thrive as a community, even, you know, despite the different economic circumstances that they might be in, right? So Larissa Adler-Lomnitz actually also provides this framework for how this reciprocal exchange is happening for the survival of low-income families. She talks about the favores, right? Los favores, or the favors, right? Which is this system of reciprocity that involves continuous exchange of complementary services motivated by an ideology of kinship. If you are at a minority serving institution, you will see a lot of this actually in place, right? Los favores, the type of things of exchanges that happen between students. I can tell you, for example, when I was a poor undergraduate student, and I remember having favores from other students, right, that were in my classes, um, and that also developed kind of like it was based on that ideology of kinship, but it's what allowed us to thrive and eventually graduate as engineers, right? El compadrazgo, right? It's another type of this network of exchange, right? So it's this mechanism of comparing official status to a situation of social closeness. So when you think, for example, in Mexico, it's very common to call other people la comadre or el compadre, right? Because it is kind of like this uh, this social closeness that exists with another individual, but it is through that exchange, right, or through that closeness, that exchange actually happens. El cuatismo, right, which is this special relationship that is often emotional, but it's also dyadic in nature, right? When you can see also again at different HSIs where people call themselves like the mi cuate or cuatazo, cuataza, right? Um, but la confianza in and of itself is important in all of these networks of exchange, right? So you have to trust the other to have the ability, the desire, and the good disposition to initiate that personal relationship for reciprocal exchange. Why am I highlighting this concept of confianza here? Without confianza, you're not developing the relationships in the classroom with your students, right? And instead of creating that space for students to learn and feel like the knowledge that they bring is contributing to conversations about engineering, about science, about math, right? They will not feel that closeness to you. And it might be even more difficult to understand what their funds of knowledge are, right? It is through confianza that you're able to identify, to acknowledge, to celebrate, to um, draw from those funds of knowledge, okay? So when we think of funds of knowledge, I think it is also important to understand that if we want to create that space for funds of knowledge, we need to build that confianza, right? Vélez Ibáñez and Greenberg say that a major characteristic of the transmission of funds of knowledge and even the acknowledgement of funds of knowledge is that multiple household domains provide children with a zone of comfort that is familiar, yet experimental, where error is not dealt with punitively and where self-esteem is not endangered. Because such transmission occurs in multiple domains, children usually can find non-stressful domains or neutral zones of comfort where little criticism is expressed and where they will be not faulted, right? This is critical if you want to um, engage in a more asset-based perspective with your students. I have here some pictures, right, of one is El Paso Juarez, which is where I lived for a very long time, right? I have my family there. The other one is like that's my mom and my sister-in-law and my niece, and they're making tamales, right? And the other picture is a fogata. It's kind of like a conversation, an informal conversation that I was having with some members of a community in Veracruz that I'm working with. Um, these are the spaces that are created, right, to allow for individuals who are sharing their funds of knowledge, right? They're allowed to experiment. They're allowed to feel secure in sharing those funds of knowledge. My niece, for example, there, she's making tamales with my mom and with um, my sister-in-law. Um, Something that I was observing there is that instead of reprimanding the child for not necessarily knowing how to make a tamal, right? Instead of that, there was more of how do we celebrate the fact that she's doing it with us, right? That she's learning these traditions, that she's learning how to work together. Um, and it was creating that space where she felt like she had the self-esteem. Her self-esteem was not in danger to engage in those practices, right? So when you think of bringing funds of knowledge into your classroom or having an asset-based approach to the things that you do in your classroom, think about this, right? That the transmission of funds of knowledge, but also the recognition of funds of knowledge occurs in a lot of different domains, but you have to create a zone of comfort where the kids, or in this case, the students, feel like it is something that is familiar to them, where they can experiment, where if something goes wrong, they're not necessarily punished, right? But where they feel like they're learning together with others, right? So that's where I want to start to kind of like frame this work on funds of knowledge. Um, and I want us to challenge these ideas that when students come into engineering spaces, that they don't know, that they don't know how to do math, that they don't know how to do science, that they don't think like an engineer, right? And I think that challenging those ideas is very important to move in a direction that is more asset-based, okay? So embracing an asset-based approach means changing that conversation from what knowledge do students need to succeed in engineering to what knowledge students offer to the construction of knowledge in engineering, okay? Um, so I'll start with that. And I want to ask you first, right, just to get us thinking about what type of spaces we have created in engineering or in STEM in general for our students. I want you to think about what knowledge is it that your students are bringing that engineering a lot of the times doesn't value. Okay, there's the link, and I think that Juanita posted the link on the chat as well. If you have used Padlet in the past, you know, just click on the plus sign and then you can add your comment there. I want you to tell us, share with us, what knowledge do your students bring that engineering doesn't always value? Okay. And what I will do, if I can find my mouse, I don't find it. Um, Let me see. Oops. Do you still see me? Sorry.
Do you want me to share my screen?
Yes, if you can share it, please. Yes. So please add your responses there. Um, what have you seen? What have you heard? What is it that a lot of the times, maybe even in conversations, in faculty meetings, it is tech a lot of these comments, I hear them in faculty meetings. I'm not gonna lie, right? So share them, share it with us. Um, um, I mean, yeah. All right, so I want to see what some people are saying here. Tinkering, yes. Yes, right? There's this idea that students tinker, they don't design, right? That's a very deficit-based perspective, right? Um, yeah, information about their communities, where they're from, right? Particularly when those institutions are not necessarily part of the ivory tower, right? Yes, growing up and learning from parents, learning from elders, right? Um, Even how they go about doing certain things, right? I can tell you that I got interested in engineering, not because I was good at math and science, but because I grew up in a farm where I was always asking questions to my parents about like, but why do we do this? Why do we have to get up at 4 a.m. to go and prevent a freeze, right? What does that do to the plants? What does that do to the fruit, right? What does that do to the apples? Um, why is it that we need to plant beans, corn, and squash at this in the same place, right? How does that help? Like, those were the questions that I was interested in asking constantly, right? That there was no space for that in a formal learning space, right? Um, those examples from lived experiences, language brokering, yes, definitely, right? Translanguaging, right? Growing up, knowing a lot of like even legal jargon a lot of the times if we are translating for our parents. That was also part of it. So yes, you're very right in saying this this comment. And I want to encourage you to think about how can we then make it more visible, right? But I want to start by saying that, Juanita, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Um, okay. All right. And you're seeing my slides, right? Yes. Okay. Thank you. I asked this question because a lot of the times people want to, particularly in engineering, I get this in engineering a lot. Just give me the 1, 2, 3 steps that I need to follow to make it happen, right? Like, how do I do it in my classroom without really engaging in a critical reflection of what you're doing, what your actions are saying, right? How you're teaching, what do you decide to bring into the curriculum, all of those things. So, starting by asking this question of what knowledge is it that my students are bringing to engineering that a lot of the times doesn't get valued, it's probably the most fundamental question that you need to start asking yourself if you want to embrace a funds of knowledge approach to the work that you're doing. Okay. Why am I saying that? And why should we care? Because we need to critically confront our own deficit perceptions about minoritized students, first of all, right? This idea that they're blank slates and that we're here just to offer everything. One thing that I tell my students is, look, I wasn't born knowing statics or dynamics. That was something that I learned, right? And I'm here to help you to get to that point, right? Instead of using a language of, you should already know this, or you should have seen this last semester, right? It's more about shifting that frame of thinking of saying, okay, what can I do now that the students are here, rather than continuously blame the previous professor? Because then it becomes a blaming game, right? We blame the previous professor blames the high school kid, the high school teachers, the high school teachers blame the middle school teachers, and then the middle school teachers blame the elementary school teachers, right? And then the elementary school teachers blame the parents and the households because the parents and the households did not prepare the students correctly, right? So we need to critically confront these ideologies. We also need to recognize that students are holders and creators of knowledge, right? And that knowledge can come in many, many different forms. And also, um, we need to build on asset methodological approaches. Why? Because these are important for meaning making practices in the classroom that a lot of the times are silenced or sanctioned or even neglected. So, what do I mean by this? If I get an asset-based methodological approach into the work that I do in the classroom, right, or pedagogical approach that I do in the classroom, I recognize that maybe some of my bilingual or multilingual students make sense of things differently, right? And maybe I need to support them in a way that is not just lecture, but I need to provide additional tools for them to be successful, okay? So I want to make this distinction between deficit and asset-based thinking, right? And that the main difference between asset-based and deficit-based perspectives lies on how individuals, communities, and groups are viewed, and the fact that engineering is not the exception, right? Deficit ideologies are actually very prevalent in engineering spaces, but they also can be very disempowering, and they can reinforce a lot of stereotypes, right? Having this idea that students need to be fixed, right? So a deficit-based language is going to focus more on problems, on needs, on failures, but an asset-based language is going to focus on the strengths, on capacities, on resilience, right? A deficit language is always going to assume that people lack what they need to succeed, but an asset-based language is always going to assume that people have valuable resources. A deficit-based language, right, is always going to approach things from a fix or remediate perspective. But an asset-based language is going to try to empower and collaborate, right, with those individuals. And the language that we use is very important. Language creates reality, right? And I think that that is something also important that you need to take with you today. The language that you use creates the reality that is seen by your students in your classroom, right? When you use words like at risk, remedial, struggling, English learner, that is very different from saying resilient, resourceful, capable, multilingual, right? So I want us to focus today on this particular aspect. How can we get to this point of asset-based language through a funds of knowledge approach? Okay. Why is it that this framing matters? If you are part of an engineering program, problem, problem framing is at the core of engineering practice. And I think that if in engineering, we start thinking more about this as how we're framing the problem, right? We would be able to think more broadly about how we approach our teaching in engineering, right? So remember that the way that we define the problem also shapes the types of solutions that we create. So as engineers, I want to encourage you, right, to think about how you're framing your engineering classroom and your engineering students, right? Because it is that way that we define those things that then it's going to shape the type of solutions that we create for it. All right. So um, just to give you some examples, right? And the type of language and the type of framing that a lot of the times we use. These students just don't know how to think like engineers. And that a lot of the times is said in response to students from a lot of different educational cultural backgrounds. I've seen it. I've seen it in my own university, right? Where that gets thrown out a lot, right? How do you think that that is framing the students, right, as just not being capable of doing it? And again, nobody's born having or thinking like an engineer, right? These are practices that you gain with, with experience too. Another example, given or having this assumption that certain students are less capable, and then they're given what is seen as the less technical responsibility, right? I've seen it with teams, like work amongst teams, team members, right? Or even when instructors intervene when something goes wrong with teamwork, right? I think that that also, again, frames and sends a particular message to students. And even when first generation students are struggling to get into a course and in engineering, the three strikes rule is very common, for example, right? A lot of advisors asking students to consider easier majors instead of actually being supported, right? And I think that that is the goal of serving the students, right? If you're working at a Hispanic serving institution, thinking about what servingness means, I think it's very important. And I know that Dr. Anne-Marie Nunez, right, talks a lot about this kind of work. How do we get to think about what servingness means, right? So let's move away from that. Let's move away from that and let's move toward a funds of knowledge approach, right? Every student comes into your classroom already knowing a lot. It's just not always what we traditionally measure, right? And so these are some of the examples that you also provided, or were very similar to the things that you provided in the Padlet, right? Bilingual students navigating multiple languages that have the skills for pattern recognition, for adaptability, right? A student who helps in a family restaurant, for example, that thinks more in terms of systems management, time coordination, customer needs, right? A student who grew up fixing trucks, right, that can bring a strong mechanical intuition, for example. And if you think about it, these are like great engineering habits of mind, right? These are the things that we want our students to get as they become engineers, right? So I'll pause here, right? And kind of, I wanted to kind of like present kind of the reasons why this work is important, how we can move toward this critical perspective, right? And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I have done in my classroom to kind of like move in that way. I have some examples that range from K through 12 to higher education. And I have provided the team at the HSI Resource Hub with also some resources and some strategies that you can use to think about how to integrate funds of knowledge into your work. So I'll go through some of that in the next few slides. Okay. All right. I want to start first, by talking about a project that I did in K-12. Remember the picture that I showed at the beginning of San Diego and Tijuana? This is a project that we did with middle school teachers in San Diego, and um, the school that we were working with had approximately 80% Latino, Latinx students, and a big majority of them received free or reduced lunch. A lot of them were also classified as English language learners. I like to use the term emergent bilinguals or multilingual students rather than using that deficit language of English language learner. I'm just saying that officially, the term that is officially used is English language learner, right? But remember, you can also shift the narrative. I want to say emergent bilinguals. And in this project, we had a lot of teachers that were working with us with different backgrounds in art and science and math and social studies, right? And so we collected more than 3 hours of field work with these teachers. It was also during the pandemic, so some of the teachers actually received pink slips in the middle of the school year, and so I want to mention that because I also want to highlight how difficult it can be a lot of the times to do this work. Because there are things that are outside of our control, and there are only certain things that we can control. Okay. Um, so, what we wanted to do was how do we get these teachers to think more broadly about funds of knowledge, acknowledge the funds of knowledge of their kids in the classroom, and also elicit those funds of knowledge, right? And get the kids to recognize those funds of knowledge. From previous work that I had done, I found out that a lot of the times, even though the students had these funds of knowledge, um, because they were kind of pushed back, they received a lot of pushback in the classroom of teachers shutting them down or telling them that they were going out of topic or things like that, right? A lot of the students tended to just not bring forth those funds of knowledge. So what we wanted to do was how can we get the teachers to not just acknowledge the funds of knowledge, but also try to elicit those funds of knowledge in the classroom, right? And celebrate them, right? So what were some of the things that we did, right? So uh, the first thing was to identify the funds of knowledge, right? And so that took a lot of work and in a lot of effort from the teachers. The teachers started with different things, like having an activity where they presented about their life histories, right, to the rest of the classroom, with surveys, right, doing caminatas, right, like community walks with the kids, and having the kids explain to them like where they got their food and their takis and their hot Cheetos and like all of these things, right? Where was the library located? Where were the spaces where they would play? Um, so it required a lot of effort in terms of like getting that information. But once we identify some of those funds of knowledge, we also were able to link them to different topics that the teachers were teaching in the classroom. So, for example, um, a lot of the kids took the transportation system in San Diego, the trolley, because they were transfronterizos as well. So they would cross the border, take the train, right, the trolley, go to school, right? And they knew a lot about the public transportation system. So we used that to teach, to work with the teachers to have lessons on literacy, right? So infographics, written words, right, what they mean. We use this knowledge that the kids were bringing to have them explain to other kids kind of how to navigate the MTS system. Also, in terms of math, right? In terms of time and money. So, if you're already late, but you need to get to this particular point, what would be the selection of routes that you would take based on a record of kind of like the different timetables to make it efficient, right? But at the same time to save money, right? There was also a lesson on environmental science, like what were the benefits of public transportation and how that benefited binational relations in the area. In terms of politics, a lot of the families that were living in San Diego, they also had families watching news in Mexico, right? And so we use that also to talk about in the social studies class, right? How to choose a topic that they found in the news, right, and work together with it. In terms of agriculture, right, a lot of the parents also had like little backyards with their fruits and vegetables, right? And so we use that idea to create a classroom garden, right, and talk about plant growth in the science classroom. Okay, so what were some of the things that the teachers were saying about funds of knowledge? Well, one is that they realized that the kids were feeling more comfortable talking about science, that even those students that tended to be a little bit more reserved, right, and not necessarily share a lot about science or the things that they were doing about science, um, they were more interested in it, right? They felt more comfortable talking about science. They felt more comfortable talking about topics that they were familiar with, right? This one teacher says, I have students that they're laying compost in their houses. So they're talking to other students about how to do it. And I like that because they bring that knowledge and they help other students learn about the processes, right? Um, there were also kind of like they talked about the importance of eliciting those funds of knowledge, right? That a lot of the times they do have all of these activities, but because they don't get recognized in the classroom, that it was up to the teacher, right, to make them more visible. Um, and also they started to see a lot of connections with the kids and the life stories of the kids, right? Um, saying, I also come here not from, not knowing any English, right? But I know that I'm using my linguistic practices to really understand what I'm doing in the classroom. So there was a lot of significance of this work, right? And I think that one of the things that I want to emphasize here, and that I emphasize also to the teachers that were working in this project, is that we don't want to romanticize the view of funds of knowledge as a framework that it's going to automatically result in curriculum. This work took a lot of reflection, right? It took a lot of involvement, patience, but also persistence, right? Persistence and knowing that there will be always that you're always challenging something that has been the norm for a very long time, right? And so engaging in these critical conversations allow the teachers to see that um, they can successfully use funds of knowledge and not necessarily hope for the one-two-step thing, right, to do in the classroom, but that it requires collaboration, that it requires conversation, that it requires getting to know the students more. This is just one of the pictures of the students doing the caminata, right, in the area. But what does this say, right? At the end, the research showed that Latino students bring a wealth of knowledge, skills, and practices that are related to engineering, right? That there's a significance of whatever happens at the home, the pedagogies of the home, right? That there are important connections between everyday lives and engineering. A lot of the times we don't see them, right? But they're there, right? And we can make them even more visible for the students. Um, Something that we learn also from this project and that the teachers learn from this project is that engineering is not just a purely cognitive process. It happens in context. It is highly influenced by social, cultural, and linguistic practices, right? And so if that is the case, if engineering is happening and it is influenced by social, cultural, and linguistic practices, we need to go where that is to be able to bring it into the classroom, right? So with that said, let's talk about engineering in higher education, right? That was for K-12, that was for middle schools. Let's talk about what from this research, what have we found? What are some of the key principles for applying funds of knowledge in engineering? I came up with 4 different principles. One is that it has to be asset-based. We need to have an asset-based framing, that we need to think about it in terms of contextual learning, that we have to develop that relational pedagogy, right? And also that it needs to include multimodal engagement. Okay. So what do I mean by asset-based framing? Well, first that we need to acknowledge that the students are bringing valuable knowledge, right? That's the first step. That's the first step. And remember the question that I asked initially, what is the knowledge that a lot of the times the students bring and it's not valued in engineering? That's what gets to this first point, right? Acknowledging that there is valuable knowledge, skills, and practices that they bring with them, right? That's the first step to getting into an asset-based framing. The second piece is making sure that we connect engineering concepts to real-life challenges and contexts that the students already know and that they care about. Remember what I said before? If engineering is not just a cognitive process, but it is happening in different contexts, right? We need to be able to provide that contextual learning for the students. Three, the relational pedagogy, right? We need to build trust and reciprocity. We need to build that confianza through respeto and through shared inquiry, right? So that means getting to know your students respectfully, learning about them, learning about their community, right? One thing that we found from the research that we had done previously with middle school teachers is that a lot of the teachers actually did not live in the communities where they were teaching. That is also the case for a lot of us who may work at institutions that are not necessarily within our own communities, right? I work at a university that is very inner, that is in the inner city, right? Very few faculty live nearby, right? And so if there's no shared inquiry, if there's no respeto in that sense, right, we're not going to be able to really learn what is the context of a lot of the lives of the students. And it also requires multimodal engagement. That means that you need to allow the students to use language, visuals, movement, and storytelling to explain and explore ideas related to engineering. Okay. How do we put this into action? I'm going to show you a few examples, but these are just simple strategies, I think, right, of how you can use, revise what you do in the classroom with a funds of knowledge informed approach, right? So let's say, for example, you do an introduction activity. And in the activity, it's an icebreaker where you ask the students about maybe significant technologies, right? So instead of doing that, maybe what you could do is get the students to map out some of the engineering practices or habits of mind that they have seen in their home and their community that are related to engineering, right? That's also an opportunity for you to think about the funds of knowledge that the kids are bringing into the classroom. Let's say, for example, if you have a design project, right? And the project involves building some artifact using Arduinos. Maybe you can shift it a little bit. You can still include the Arduinos, right? But maybe you can work with a community partner, um, or have the students identify those community partners within their own community, right? And design a solution or an approach that, or to some type of concern using accessible materials, but also family or community insights, right? When it comes to group work, we love to do teamwork, right? And so maybe what we could do is assign roles and rotate leadership so that every student can contribute based on their lived experiences, right? And then after the group work, you can have the students reflect on what is it that they learned from each other, right? Or how their own experiences help the group instead of trying to give a ranking to the other members of the team, right? Talk about how they're learning from each other. When it comes to assessment, we're very familiar with tests and quizzes, right? So maybe it's important to include oral presentations, community interviews, bilingual posters, right? Portfolios that maybe reflect the students' ways of knowing. So how have I done this in my own classroom? So this was part of a project where we wanted to change the conversation about silos, right? The fact that a lot of the times engineering tends to be taught very separate from the social aspects or the lived experiences of the students, and so we wanted to bring it together, right? To merge those silos, and it is through that merging of those silos, right, that we start looking at maybe some of the critical questions that we want the students also to ask but also ourselves to ask, right? So for example, how communities are resisting hacking or even reimagining dominant technologies, right? What are the funds of knowledges that come from that? What is the impact of race, class, gender, language in shaping engineering careers and tools, right? What are the lived effects of inequitable infrastructure, design, and policy? A lot of our students may be very familiar with that, right? Um, like I mentioned, I was one of those kids that got displaced because of policies that were completely out of my control, right? But I had an understanding of the impact that it had on my community, right? So maybe that's an opportunity for you to also get the students to think about what are the solutions that can come from the community, right? So for me, this is more of a framework that I use to think about kind of like the questions that I want to ask my students, to think more critically about what they're designing, to help them feel like they can bring their own funds of knowledge into the conversations, right? And so when we think of rethinking engineering through fonts of knowledge, I already said this, get to know the students' backgrounds. You can do fonts of knowledge mapping with them, storytelling, journaling. You can ask the students to understand the backgrounds of others to have an appreciation for fonts of knowledge within the classroom. You can use open-ended community-based design projects, design problems with multiple solution paths, right? Et cetera, et cetera. For this, I have created, it's kind of a template, a worksheet with questions. And I know that they're going to be posted in the resource hub, so you will have access to them. Okay. But these are questions for you as an instructor to think about how you want to recreate maybe an activity in your classroom, right? And the first part of that is to document those fonts of knowledge, right? Document how you're going to do those things. The second piece is to implement. How are you going to implement this in the classroom in a way that aligns with a fonts of knowledge approach, right? And then the third piece, which I did not include a picture here, but is how are you going to sustain it, right? So some questions also to help you think about how you can sustain this work. What has this resulted in my classroom? Okay. Well, one of the things that my students worked on, this was for a class that I was teaching in engineering and social justice. I asked my students to go out in the community and think about problems that were being faced by the community. Some of my students partner up with an organization that they were familiar with, right? To think about what was creating the hepatitis pandemic in San Diego back in 2015, 2016. And so they found out that there was a correlation between the time when the plastic bags were banned in California and the number of cases of hepatitis B, hepatitis A in San Diego County. They realized that part of it was that a lot of the hotspots for hepatitis B spreading were basically where a lot of people experiencing homelessness were. With the banning of the plastic bags, there was no more access for these individuals who were unhoused, right? And a lot of them living on the streets. To defecate, right? So fecal matter, it's the main cause or one of the causes for the spread of hepatitis, right? And so there was that correlation. So what that led to was how can then we, they're interviewing individuals in the community. They're gathering information from all of these community partners that they were part of, right? A lot of them were affected by these issues, right? And so they were able to come up with not necessarily a particular solution, right, at this time, but they came up with a big correlation between what was happening in San Diego and the policies and and having a more critical understanding of policies, right, and the impact that it has on vulnerable communities, for example. Another project that this resulted in, some of my students were working in their capstone senior design project, and they were supposed to build this drone that was to be used to mitigate fires in Southern California. Um, they realized that the technology was just to build a technology, right? And even though a lot of them were impacted by the fires, right? They knew that there were other things that needed to be taken into consideration. For example, fire mitigation by the Kumeyaay community, right, which is an indigenous community within Southern California and in San Diego County and in northern Baja California. Um, and they were like, well, we're not necessarily listening to the community. Like, who do we need to talk to be able to solve these issues? And so a lot of them were bringing these funds of knowledge into the classroom. They were thinking more critically about how they could approach this problem from a more social justice perspective and who they needed to involve in the process, right? So these are just projects that were guided by these ideas of thinking critically about those intersections of engineering, lived experience, and society, right? Another example of a project that I created for my students, this was from an engineering, first year engineering course on design. Um, a lot of my students came from communities in the southern border with Mexico, between Texas and Mexico. And they talked constantly about the lack of um, infrastructure in some of their areas, right? This is an area that is very low income. And so they, I guess, doing a little bit more digging, right? I found out about the establishment of the colonias in these areas, which are not necessarily recognized by the county. So they don't have really a lot of rights, right? And so for water distribution, what happens is that a pipe goes, not a pipe, a container, a water container goes into their communities maybe like once or twice a week, and then it distributes the water. Most of the water tends to be carried by children or by women. Um, and so they were talking about like the lack of infrastructure. What do we do? What do we do when there are things that are impacting our communities in terms of water security, right? Particularly communities that we're familiar with. And so, what I really appreciated about this particular project is that the students themselves were the ones contributing to the knowledge construction here, right? Um, because a lot of the students started to talk about just build pipes, you just need a pump and that's it. Like how difficult can that be, right? But then a lot of the students started talking about how a lot of these communities they just have septic tanks, for example, right? Um, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have reliable electricity. They even the fact that they need to maintain the water clean. It's an area that is very humid, so the harboring of mosquitoes can happen. The spread of um, dengue could, for example, could happen, right? And so once the students started talking about kind of like what is the best way to get something for them, they started to think more critically about how we are defining efficiency in engineering, how we are defining productivity in engineering, how we are defining problem solving in engineering, right? And think about the fact that a lot of the times the circumstances are very difficult, right? They don't necessarily lead to optimal solutions. And a lot of the times working in solutions requires the knowledge of other people, not just engineers, right? And so they came out, for example, with this idea of um, the water pump, what's it called? A ram pump, right? That doesn't require electricity. It just based on principles of physics, right? To get the water to be distributed and don't have like little children having to carry water to, very long distances, right? And so it was an interesting project, right? That they themselves worked on. They were able to also use a lot of sense making in this process, right? Like, how do we really do this without wasting a lot of water, but at the same time, reaching the objectives that we want. It included a lot of input from the other students working in the project, right? Um, and okay, so again, for a lot of the students was the idea of efficiency doesn't really mean having an electric grid that can put it all together for you, but making something that is for the survival of a lot of these communities, right? When you think of assessment, like for example, I use presentation grading rubrics, right? Where I want to make sure that the students are thinking about how they bring this funds of knowledge. How do they include the community in these conversations? If they did a community walk, what did they learn from that community walk, right? Um, in terms of the habits of mind that they have developed in terms of engineering, right? Is there a reflection and understanding of what is the current context in which they're doing this engineering work? Um, this is mostly for projects. I have also done this, for example, or drawing from funds of knowledge for tests, for example, like open-ended questions, right? When we were talking about the issues about people experiencing homelessness, right? They were very familiar with the type of designs that engineers engage in and how they can impact community members or people, or not necessarily understanding all of the issues that go with experiencing homelessness. Um, I also created this example of an engineering problem, and the students were supposed to identify the errors, the biases, and the implied solutions, think about the objectives and the constraints. It was based around something that they were familiar with and something that they were very frustrated with, which was the registration system to get into classes at UTSA, right? And so again, something that is familiar to them. Another example is just to get for this class on thermodynamics, think about how the students are going to use thermodynamics principles to explore something that they're just fascinated with, right? And it doesn't have to be the right or the wrong answer. It's for them to explore, right? For them to explore how they're using all of these skills, everything that they have learned, everything that they have accumulated to make sense of something, right? Um, and in the process, they also talk about how they're using those equations that we learned in the class to analyze their problem. What type of experiments they want to design to make sure that they collect the data to get that information, right? What were the results? What what do you make up of those results? Are they good? Are they not good? You know? So again, just some examples of how you can go into this asset-based perspective. Um, language in and of itself is very important too, right? So think about the fact that landscapes shape and redefine language, culture, power, and identity, right? So think about what is around, right? These are pictures that I took from when I was at UTSA, at a Hispanic Serving Institution, right? Um, the students are using these linguistic practices, right? They're using the like the quesadillas, right? Like como la flour que dice ahí, the for the quesadilla, or no me queda más que comerme una rica quesadilla. Like they're playing around with the language. They're using these linguistic practices. And so thinking about how you can integrate language as a fund of knowledge into what you do is very important. I put a picture here of a book from a colleague of mine, Alberto Esquinca and Idalis Villanueva Alarcón, who wrote a book for a guide for elementary bilingual and dual language programs that gives like just great ideas, right? But think about how you can use about reframing bilingualism from a barrier to maybe a design tool in your own projects, right? Like one thing that I allowed my students was to say, if you want to do your poster bilingually, you're more than welcome to do that, right? Um, so think about real world bilingualism in engineering, right? Whether it is in terms of safety protocols, client communication, international standards, you name it, right? Um, and I'm trying to go through this quick. Again, these are just examples. I'm more than happy to share this with you later on. But what are some examples of multilingualism in engineering? For example, the mechanics in everyday life. You can ask the students to keep a bilingual journal just for them, right? and where they're documenting examples of mechanical principles in their homes or in their communities. Just that, right? Um, you don't have to grade it. You just have to acknowledge that it exists, right? Um, Community design-based projects like the ones that I had mentioned in the past, right? Culturally responsive product design. So thinking about, for example, how do you integrate cultural and linguistic practices into like designing a cooking appliance, right? Or something that is adapted to language and culture for different communities. Um, I have, for K through 12, we have created a lot of these examples of curriculum that are bilingual, right? Presenting like client stories, this is more K-12, but it's from a research project that I had with PBS, where we distributed this bilingual curriculum to different organizations, different after-school programs. And right now I'm working also on another project where we're developing this curricular materials where we're trying to integrate indigenous knowledge into it, right? Particularly from the Nahua and the Totonaca in Veracruz. This is just an example of kind of like the materials that we have created, showing what are some of the practices for plant and food preparation among the Totonacos with the Pashnikak. And we go into kind of like what is the cell structure of the plant. One of the things that the Totonacos talk about is that they need to prepare it in order to extract the oxalates that come from the plant, right? And so it also provides us with kind of a segue for us to talk about cell structure, where those oxalates are collected, right? With why is it important to do that, but also think about how we prepare other foods and what are some of the other things that we talked about in terms of preparing other foods to prevent like food poisoning, for example, right? Um, okay. One thing that I also want to talk about is the importance of using Chicana feminist epistemologies in trying to do this work. And something that I have done is to engage in pláticas with my students. A lot of the times when I present this work, the main question is like, how do I learn about the funds of knowledge of my students? Engage in pláticas, right? Engage in those conversations. Pláticas are meant to build that confianza with your students, right? It requires that you become a little bit more vulnerable with your students, right? That you incorporate everyday life and experiences. A lot of the times it's just in terms of check-ins, catch-ups, right? Regañadas, consejos, chisme, whatever, right? But that is how you get to understand the funds of knowledge of your students. Some of the things that I have been able to learn from my participants through my research and the things that they're interested in is that, for example, a lot of the times there's a lot of language subtraction in the classroom, right? So that's why I want to emphasize the importance of thinking about how important it is to integrate multilingualism, particularly if you want to address something through funds of knowledge. One thing that I think is actually very cool that came out of this from this particular project is how then we can use tools that are already out there for students to build their own life stories or to talk about the funds of knowledge that they see in their communities. I use, for example, a tool called Animaker. I'm gonna play the video. This video is pretty much um, this particular participant telling his whole story, right? This is part of a different research project, but what I'm saying here is that you could use something like Animaker, something short, 1-2 minutes, for the students to map out the funds of knowledge in their community or in their home or things like that, right? Talk about their own life stories.
Leo is a Mexican-American undergraduate at a prestigious research-oriented university in California. He started his higher education journey as a mechanical engineering major. Coming from a low-income household, Leo always felt obligated to keep on-campus employment to defray the cost of tuition, housing, and food that his financial aid package did not cover. He attended a poorly funded high school where his science and math classes were not the best, as he described it. He constantly mentioned the ways that not being exposed to STEM activities in K through 12 put him at a disadvantage compared to his middle and upper class peers. Having to juggle job responsibilities, coupled with a lack of schooling opportunities growing up, Leo constantly struggled to fully grasp class content and to submit assignments on time. Unfortunately, Leo eventually failed several classes. Every time Leo failed a class, he was asked by the financial aid office to pay back to the university the cost of tuition and fees for the failed class. In meetings with his academic advisors, they would state that putting so many hours at work was causing him to fail classes. Ironically, working that much was also what allowed him to stay in college. Leo could have asked his professors for extensions, given that he was not able to submit work on time because of his full-time employment responsibilities. However, he was discouraged from doing so by a no extensions, no exceptions policy on his syllabi. As he kept failing classes, Leo was put on academic probation, which required him to undergo an administrative process involving the collection of signatures from the two of his advisors and from the professor who taught the course he failed. Failing the course came at a high price, in the amount of $5,000, the full balance of course tuition received from the financial aid office. Leo's family gathered the money.
I will stop here and move on just because of the time. But this is pretty much what the students can do with Animaker. I have used it in the past for the students to, like I said, explore funds of knowledge in the community, like when they do caminatas, what they have found in the caminatas, what are some of the things that they see, even in their own households and communities. It's also a way for me to get to know the students. It's very simple. 1 minute and you get a lot of information, right? I've also included this as part of the workshop materials that you can have access to. It talks about kind of like the essence of what is Chicano feminist epistemology, what are some of the aspects of Chicano feminist epistemology and why they're important for to build that confianza in a sense, right? And then I have also like this idea of the multimedia tool of doing Animaker, right? Where you ask the students to create a short animated video that shows how engineering or problem solving happens in your home, for example, right? All right. So last but not least, I want to say that this work is better if you implement it in community, right? Live your life, observe, document, and then create, right? First, you need to be aware of what is surrounding you, what is the context in which you are doing your work. So live your life, but also be observant of what you're seeing, right? Document it and then create the work that you want to do. Try to make sure that you tailor the examples to your audience and the context, right? You will notice that a lot of the problems that I did were very place-based scenarios, right? When I worked in San Diego, it was on San Diego. When I worked in South Texas, it was based on South Texas. A lot of the times we try to bring this idea, we have this idea that it has to be from communities, even outside of our communities, for them to be relevant. But no, you can find a lot of things within your own community that are very relevant for the students. Also be prepared to feel like a student. Trust the process. A lot of the times we get frustrated with students. Be prepared to be a student. Trust the process, make models, share with others. It is okay to say, I don't know, but also to learn from others and ask for help. So be in that student mindset. Also, you don't have to do everything at once. You can start by something simple, integrating something at the end of the course. Like, for example, the project that I did at the end of the course, it was very low stakes, right? But it allowed the students to explore something that was of interest to them and at the same time integrating their own knowledge and what they had learned in the class. Integrate rather than recreate. So wrap that context around what you already know. You don't have to recreate the whole course. And what are you taking away with you today reflection at the end of the day can go a long way. If at the end of the day, you just ask the students very quickly, tell me what you're taking with you today. That will start to help to build that confiance in the classroom, right? So sit down, reflect, and reiterate. Also, I added this like strategies for the classroom. Again, some examples, they have been provided to the HSI Resource Hub. This work is done because of the National Science Foundation. And so I thank you for your time. I'm sorry I talked a lot and I presented a lot of things, but I hope that it was extremely helpful for you today.